The candles at Hartfield House numbered in the hundreds on the night of the Christmas masquerade, and the masks below them numbered nearly as many. Cecily Fenwick counted neither. She stood at the edge of the ballroom floor in a gown borrowed from her brother's landlady, a half veil of cream lace pinned to her hair with her mother's ivory cameo, and she held herself the way she had learned to hold herself across 4 years of being no one in particular. Straight-backed, still-handed, occupying the least possible space. The season had not invited her. Edmund had. Her brother's letter had arrived in Bath 6 weeks prior, cheerful and badly spelled, informing her that his oldest friend, Lord Ashworth, the Earl of Hartfield, had insisted the Fenwicks spend Christmas at his estate, and that Edmund had accepted on her behalf before she could invent a reason to refuse. She had not seen Hartfield since she was 19. She had not seen Lord Ashworth since the summer her father lost everything, and she had left for a life of fetching shawls and reading aloud to elderly women who could not remember her name. Now the ballroom pressed around her with silk and laughter, and the particular confidence of people who had never fetched anything for anyone, and Cecily pressed her gloved fingers against the cameo beneath the lace, and reminded herself that the veil was a mercy. No one here needed to know that the woman standing by the third pillar was Edmund Fenwick's little sister. No one here needed to see her at all. She did not see it yet. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who do not know your name, you might already feel what is coming. Stay close. Across the floor, past the swirl of feathered masks and jeweled dominoes, Lord Ashworth stood with his back to the fireplace and his face half covered by a plain black mask that did nothing to soften the severity of his jaw. He was not dancing. He had not danced all evening. Lady Margrave, his aunt, had positioned Miss Arabella Lyndhurst at his elbow 3 separate times since the music began, and 3 separate times he had failed to offer his hand. He held a glass of wine he had not tasted, and watched the room with the flat, patient attention of a man who had learned long ago that most rooms held nothing worth watching. His gaze moved across the crowd. It passed the knot of officers near the punch table, past Edmund laughing too loudly by the door, past the cluster of young women adjusting one another's ribbons, and stopped. It stopped on the woman by the third pillar. She wore no jewels. Her gown was plain, the color of weak tea, and the lace at her throat was mended at one edge. The half veil obscured her features from the brow to the lip, but her posture was precise, almost architectural, and her ungloved left hand rested against something small and pale, pinned beneath the lace at her collarbone. She was not looking at anyone. She was not looking for anyone. She stood in the attitude of a person who had come to watch and expected nothing else. Lord Ashworth's fingers tightened on the stem of his glass. The motion was small. No one in the room marked it. He set the glass down on the mantel behind him and crossed the floor. Cecily did not see him coming. She was watching a pair of girls in matching blue dominoes attempt a figure of the dance and falter at the turn. And she was smiling behind the veil at the way the shorter girl caught the taller girl's hand and pulled her back into the line. The small kindness of it. The way the room forgave a stumble when the stumbler was dressed in silk. "You are not dancing," said a voice beside her, low and level. She turned. The man in the black mask stood 2 feet from her, and the firelight behind him threw his shadow long across the marble. He was tall. His shoulders filled the dark coat without ornament, and his mouth, the only part of his face fully visible below the mask, was set in a line that was not quite stern and not quite patient. "I am not," Cecily said. She heard her own voice come out steadier than she expected. "Is it preference or lack of partner?" "It is lack of invitation, my lord." Something shifted in the line of his mouth, not a smile. The faintest disturbance of the surface, the way a stone dropped into a still pond, sends a single ring outward before the water swallows it. "Then I am inviting you," he said. He offered his hand. She looked at it. The glove was gray, fine-grained, and the fingers were long and still. He did not withdraw the offer. He did not soften it with explanation or apology. He simply held his hand in the air between them and waited. Cecily's pulse climbed in her throat. She could feel it there, vivid and specific. A small treason her body was committing without her mind's permission. She placed her fingers in his. His hand closed. Not tight. Not possessive. Simply closed, the way a door closes when it has found its frame. They danced. She did not know the name of the dance, but her feet remembered the figures from a time before Bath, before the old woman's drawing room, before the worn carpet and the untuned pianoforte. Lord Ashworth danced with a controlled economy that matched his speech. He did not flourish. He did not perform. He guided her through the figures with the pressure of his palm against hers and a single brief correction when the line turned and she hesitated. "You dance well," he said after the first figure closed. "I used to," she said. "A long time ago." "Not so long. You cannot be much past 20. "I am 24, my lord." The faintest pause in his step. Recovered in an instant, invisible to anyone not held in the circle of his arms. She felt it. The stutter of his rhythm against her palm. She did not know what it meant. 24, he repeated, as though the number contained information he needed to sort. They did not speak again through the second figure. The music carried them. His hand stayed exactly where propriety permitted, his thumb resting against the base of her gloved fingers, and Cecily was aware, with an exactness that frightened her, of the precise temperature of his palm through 2 layers of cotton. When the second figure ended, and the couples paused for the violinist to retune, Lord Ashworth did not release her hand. "Will you tell me your name?" he asked. "The masks are meant to make names unnecessary, my lord. They are meant to make honesty possible. I am asking for yours." The request was plain. No ornamentation, no gallantry. Cecily felt the cameo press against her collarbone beneath the lace, and she thought of the name it carried. Her mother's name, engraved in script so fine you had to hold it to the light. "Eleanor." "I cannot," she said. She withdrew her hand from his. The separation was small, 3 inches of air between his fingertips and hers. And it cost her something she could not yet name. She stepped back. She turned. She walked toward the door Edmund had been standing beside. And she did not look back. And she did not see Lord Ashworth's hand remain exactly where she had left it, suspended in the space above the empty floor, for 3 full seconds before he lowered it to his side. The veil hid her face. It did not hide the flush that had climbed from her throat to her jaw. Edmund found her in the corridor. He was flushed with wine and good humor, and entirely without his mask, which he had lost somewhere near the punch table. He slung an arm around her shoulders and grinned. "There you are. Enjoying yourself? I think I should like to go upstairs, Edmund." "Nonsense. The night is young. Come. I will introduce you to Ashworth properly. He has been asking after you." "He does not know me, Edmund." "Of course he does. You are my sister." He said it with the easy confidence of a man who believed that being someone's sister was an identity sufficient to carry a woman through any room. Cecily pressed her fingers against the cameo through her gown and said nothing. The following morning, the masks were gone and the candles were cold stubs in their sconces, and the great hall of Hartfield House smelled of pine boughs and leftover wax. Cecily came down early, before Edmund, before the other guests, before even the footman had finished clearing the last of the champagne glasses from the ballroom. She had slept badly. The memory of his hand closing around hers had followed her into the dark and stayed there, patient and specific. and she had lain in the narrow guest bed with her mother's cameo on the table beside her, and listened to the house settle around her, and thought of nothing. Nothing at all, except the temperature of his palm. She found the small parlor at the end of the east corridor, the one Edmund had told her was rarely used, and she sat at the pianoforte that stood against the far wall. The instrument was old, but someone had kept it in tune. She ran her fingers across the keys. A scale, then a chord, then the opening bars of a Clementi sonatina she had played for her mother before her mother died. The music came back to her the way the dance had come back to her the night before. Her hands remembered what her life had tried to make her forget. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the footstep on the threshold, or the breath drawn and held. Lord Ashworth stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame. He had come from the stables, his boots still carrying the cold, and he had heard the music from the corridor and followed it without deciding to. He watched her hands on the keys. He watched the line of her neck, bent slightly forward, the way a person bends towards something they are trying to hear more clearly. The cream lace was gone. The veil was gone. Her face was plain and open in the gray winter light, and her hair was gathered simply at her nape, and the ivory cameo was pinned at her collar where anyone could see it. He recognized the cameo first. Then he recognized the hands. The specific way the left hand reached for the lower register, the fourth finger leading. The wrist turned slightly inward. He had watched those hands the night before. He had held them. "Cecily," he said. She stopped playing. Her hand stilled on the keys, and the last note hung in the room like a held breath. She turned on the bench and saw him, and the color rose in her face, and she understood in a single terrible instant that the man in the black mask had been Lord Ashworth, and that Lord Ashworth now knew that the veiled woman had been her. "My lord," her voice was very controlled, "I did not realize anyone was awake. You are Edmund's sister." "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes, a recognition, a recalculation, something she could not read. His hand dropped from the doorframe. He took one step into the room, and then stopped, as though the distance between the threshold and the pianoforte contained more than 12 feet of parquet floor. "The sonatina," he said. "You play it without the score." "I learned it a long time ago." "You learned it well." He stood there. She sat there. The room held them both in the gray light, and neither of them moved. And Cecily thought that this was the cruelest possible version of the morning after a masquerade. The veil had given her permission to be someone. The daylight had taken it back. Lord Ashworth turned and left the parlor without another word. His boot steps retreated down the corridor, deliberate and even, and Cecily sat at the pianoforte with her hands in her lap and listened to them go. That afternoon, Lady Margrave arrived. She came in a carriage drawn by 4 matched greys, with 2 trunks, a maid, and Miss Arabella Lyndhurst at her side, and she swept into Hartfield House with the particular energy of a woman who had come to settle something. Edmund, who had been reading by the fire in the main parlor, stood and bowed and received her greeting with the mild confusion of a man who had not known she was expected. Cecily, seated in the window alcove with her needlework, received no greeting at all. Lady Margrave paused at the edge of the room and surveyed the company. Her gaze moved past Edmund, past the fire, past the arrangement of holly on the mantel, and found Cecily in the alcove the way a bird of prey finds a small movement in a field. "Ah," she said, turning to Miss Lyndhurst, "Edmund's little sister. I had forgotten she was here." The words were pitched low, spoken to Arabella, spoken in the corridor between the parlor and the stairs, spoken in the precise register of a woman who did not care whether the subject heard. Cecily heard. She kept her needle moving. She did not look up. Miss Lyndhurst was beautiful in the way that money and confidence and an excellent modiste could make a woman beautiful. Her gown was winter white, trimmed in silver fox at the cuffs, and she wore sapphires at her throat that caught the firelight and threw it back in small blue sparks. She sat beside Lord Ashworth at dinner that evening, and spoke to him with the easy familiarity of a woman who had been told she was the correct choice, and Lord Ashworth replied to her in the short, level sentences he used for everyone. And Cecily sat at the far end of the table between Edmund and an elderly clergyman, and ate very little and said less. After dinner, the party gathered in the drawing-room. Lady Margrave arranged the seating with the efficiency of a general, and Miss Lyndhurst found herself beside Lord Ashworth on the settee, and Cecily found herself beside Edmund near the door. Lord Ashworth's face was the same controlled surface it had been all evening. When Miss Lyndhurst laid her hand on his arm to emphasize a point about the Christmas concert at the village church, he did not flinch, and he did not move, and he did not look at Cecily. Cecily looked at the fire instead. She watched the flames work at a log of apple wood, and thought about how a masquerade could teach you the shape of a man's hand, and the weight of his attention, and the particular way he waited for an answer, and how the morning after could teach you that none of it had been meant for you. It had been meant for a woman in a veil, a woman who did not exist. The next morning, Lady Margrave arranged a walk through the grounds. She placed Miss Lyndhurst on Lord Ashworth's arm with the practiced efficiency of a woman laying a table for state guests, and she placed herself on Edmund's arm. And she did not place Cecily anywhere at all. Cecily walked behind them, alone, and the frost on the gravel crunched beneath her boots, which were her only pair and worn thin at the left heel. The December wind cut through her borrowed pelisse. She did not complain. She watched the bare oaks lining the drive and counted their limbs the way she had counted the days in Bath, one by one, to keep the hours from pooling. Lord Ashworth's head turned once, a small motion, barely a quarter turn, directed back over his shoulder toward the woman walking alone behind his party. His eyes found Cecily's face and held there for a fraction of a second, long enough for her to register the attention and short enough for her to doubt it. Then he faced forward again. Miss Lyndhurst, whose hand rested in the crook of his elbow, did not appear to notice. Lady Margrave, who missed nothing, did. That afternoon, Cecily helped the housekeeper, Mrs. Arden, arrange pine boughs and holly in the servants' hall. Mrs. Arden was a stout, warm woman of 60, who had served Hartfield House since before Lord Ashworth was born, and she treated Cecily with the instinctive kindness of a woman who recognized useful hands and a willing disposition. They worked together in the low-ceilinged hall, twisting greenery around the sconce brackets and laying sprigs of rosemary along the long table. And the work was plain and physical and required no performance. Cecily's shoulders loosened for the first time since the masquerade. Her fingers moved through the pine needles, releasing their cold, sharp scent, and she hummed the Clementi sonatina without thinking, and Mrs. Arden smiled at her across the table and said nothing about it. The following day brought rain. The guests gathered in the main parlor, and Lady Margrave produced a set of card tables and organized the company into groups, and once again, Cecily was not organized into anything. She found the elderly clergyman, Mr. Halford, dozing in the window seat with a volume of sermons open on his knee and his spectacles slipping down his nose. His eyes were too tired to read, he told her when she asked. The print swam. She offered to read aloud, and he accepted with the grateful formality of a man who did not wish to impose. And she sat beside him in the window seat and read for an hour in a voice steady enough to carry the weight of someone else's words. Lord Ashworth passed the window seat twice during that hour. The first time, he slowed but did not stop, and Cecily did not look up from the page. The second time, he stopped entirely, standing at the edge of the corridor with one hand at his breast pocket, watching her read. The clergyman had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest and a faint smile on his face, and Cecily had lowered her voice to a murmur rather than stop, because stopping would mean the silence would wake him, and she had decided his rest was more important than her own discomfort at being watched. Lord Ashworth's hand pressed once against the breast pocket of his coat, and then dropped. He left without speaking. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Cecily found the kitchen corridor early, before the household had risen. A young kitchen maid named Nell sat on the bottom stair with a torn apron in her lap and tears on her cheeks. She had caught the hem on a nail, carrying the breakfast trays, and Lady Margrave did not tolerate untidiness among the staff. And Nell was new and young and certain she would be dismissed. Cecily knelt on the cold flagstones beside her. She took the apron and the needle Nell offered and began to mend the tier with the small, even stitches she had perfected in 4 years of making things last longer than they were designed to last. She spoke to Nell while she worked, not about the apron and not about Lady Margrave, about the frost patterns on the kitchen window that morning, and whether Nell had family to write to at Christmas, and whether the cook had let her taste the mince pies. Lord Ashworth came into the corridor from the stables with his boots still carrying the cold. He found Cecily kneeling on the flagstones with a needle and thread, mending the kitchen maid's hem while Nell stood beside her, wiping her eyes. "Miss Fenwick." Cecily looked up from the flagstones. Lord Ashworth stood above her in the corridor, and his face was very still, and his hands were at his sides. "Come inside," he said. "It is too cold to sit on stone." "I am nearly finished, my lord." "You will finish inside. Come." His voice was level. It was not unkind. It carried the same unadorned authority she had heard at the Masquerade when he said, "I am inviting you," and it contained the same strange quality she could not name, the quality that lived somewhere between command and care. She rose. She followed him into the small parlor, and he held the door for her, and when she passed through it, his hand moved briefly toward her elbow, and then withdrew, and the withdrawal was so precise and so deliberate that it told her more than the touch would have. He left her there. The kitchen maid found her a moment later, confused and grateful. Cecily finished the mending by the fire instead of the flagstones, and her fingers were warm, and the cameo at her collar pressed against her throat when she bent her head, and she thought of nothing. She told herself she thought of nothing. That same afternoon, Miss Lyndhurst found Cecily alone in the morning room and arranged herself on the settee opposite, with the graceful economy of a woman settling in for a conversation she intended to control. "You must find this all rather overwhelming," Arabella said. "A house this size, the company. I imagine Bath was quieter." "It was," Cecily said. "Edmund speaks of you so fondly. The Fenwick girl, he says. His little sister who reads to old women and mends things." Arabella smiled. It was a smile of genuine warmth, which made it worse. "I think it is lovely that Lord Ashworth includes you at Christmas. He is generous that way. He would never turn away his friend's sister." His friend's sister. Not a guest. Not a woman. An appendage to a brother, tolerated by proximity, included by obligation. Cecily pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her forefinger beneath the fold of her skirt and held her face very still. "Lord Ashworth has been most kind," she said. "He has," Arabella agreed. She smoothed the silver fox at her cuff. "And his aunt has such plans for the new year." "I should not say, of course. It is not yet settled." She paused beautifully. "Or perhaps it is." The room was very warm. The fire was very bright. Cecily excused herself and walked to her room and closed the door and stood at the window and pressed her forehead against the glass and felt the cold of it against her skin. And her body knew what her mind would not permit. and her body did not care about permission. She stayed there until the glass warmed beneath her skin and lost its comfort. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ivory cameo on the nightstand. Her mother had worn it every day until the day she died, when Cecily was 14. Her father had placed it in Cecily's hand at the funeral and closed her fingers around it and said, "She wanted you to have something that remembered her." 2 years later, her father had lost the house, the land, the small income that had kept the Fenwicks respectable. Edmund had gone to London to work as a clerk in a solicitor's office. Cecily had gone to Bath, to Mrs. Cavendish, to 4 years of fetching shawls and reading novels aloud in a drawing room that smelled of camphor and old lace. Mrs. Cavendish had not been unkind. She had simply not seen Cecily as a person. She had seen her as a function. A voice. A pair of hands. A presence in the room whose purpose was to prevent the room from being empty. Cecily picked up the cameo and turned it over. The engraving on the back caught the candlelight. Eleanor. Her mother's name in script so fine it was almost invisible. She had been invisible for 4 years. She had come to Hartfield and put on a veil, and been seen, once, for one evening, by a man who did not know her name. And now Arabella Lyndhurst was smoothing the fox fur on her cuff and talking about plans for the new year. And Cecily was sitting on a narrow guest bed, holding her dead mother's cameo. And understanding, with a precision that felt like a needle through cloth, that being seen once was worse than never being seen at all. What she did not yet know was that 2 floors below, in the library, he kept locked to every guest except Edmund. Lord Ashworth was holding a small oval miniature in his hand, and thinking about the same thing. If you sense what is gathering beneath this roof, you are right. Stay. On Christmas Eve morning, before the household stirred, Lord Ashworth sat alone in that library with the miniature open on his palm. The portrait was of a girl of 15, dark-haired, bright-eyed, painted the year before she died. Charlotte, his sister. 3 years gone from a fever that had taken her in 11 days, while he sat in a London drawing-room reading a letter she had written asking him to come home. He had come home. He had come home 4 days too late. The miniature lived in the breast pocket of his coat, and the coat lived on his body, and Charlotte lived nowhere except in the paint, and in the permanent crevice her absence had cut into the center of his chest. He had learned, in the 3 years since, to build the crevice into a room, and to wall the room shut, and to conduct himself as though the room did not exist. He had learned to fill his house with guests at Christmas, so the corridors would not sound the way they had sounded the first December without her, when every footstep echoed in a frequency that belonged only to the dead. He closed the miniature and placed it back in his pocket. He pressed his hand flat against the coat, over the place where Charlotte's face rested against his heart. The hand stayed there for a long moment. He had watched Cecily Fenwick kneel on a cold floor to mend a servant's torn hem, and the quality of her attention, the steadiness of it, the way she had spoken to the crying girl as though the girl's distress were the most important thing in any room, had opened the door of the walled room, and what had come through the door was not grief. It was recognition. It was the understanding that the woman kneeling on the flagstones possessed the quality he had failed to give his own sister when she needed it. Presence. The simple, costly, unglamorous act of being where you are needed and nowhere else. He rose from the chair. He left the library. He went to find Edmund. The Christmas Eve ball was smaller than the Masquerade, a gathering of 40 rather than 300, and no one wore masks. The great hall had been dressed in evergreen and candles, and the string quartet played from the gallery above, and Lady Margrave wore rubies and satisfaction in equal measure. She had spent the afternoon in conference with Lord Ashworth's solicitor, and she had spent the hour before the ball arranging Miss Lyndhurst's hair and instructing the footman on the placement of the announcement wine. She stood beside the fireplace at the north end of the hall and surveyed the room with the calm confidence of a woman whose architecture was about to bear weight. Cecily wore her only evening gown, the same gown she had worn to the masquerade, the color of weak tea, without the veil. The ivory cameo was pinned at her collar. She stood beside Edmund near the door, and Edmund was cheerful, and the wine was warm, and the candles threw her shadow long and thin across the floor. A woman Cecily did not know, the wife of a neighboring squire, leaned toward her companion and said, in the particular carrying whisper of a woman who had drunk 2 glasses of punch before the music started, "Poor Edmund's sister. She has nothing, you know, not a penny, and not a prospect. Lady Margrave says Lord Ashworth keeps her on from charity." Cecily heard. Her hand found the cameo at her throat. She held it there and said nothing. Lady Margrave stepped forward. She lifted her glass. The room quieted. "It is my great pleasure," Lady Margrave said, "to share news that will gladden every heart in this room. My nephew, Lord Ashworth, the Earl of Hartfield, has chosen a bride worthy of his name and his family's legacy." She extended her hand toward Arabella, who stood in winter white beside the Christmas tree, her sapphires blazing. "Miss Arabella Lyndhurst has accepted his proposal, and the wedding will take place in the spring." The room applauded. Arabella smiled. Edmund turned to Cecily with his mouth open and his brow furrowed, because Edmund, for all his faults, had eyes, and what his eyes had seen across the last 4 days did not match the announcement his ears had just received. Cecily did not move. She stood exactly where she was, beside her brother, near the door, with her hand on her mother's cameo and her face as composed as any mask she had ever worn. The room applauded around her, and the sound was very far away, and the candles were very bright, and she thought, with a clarity that hurt more than any of it, that she had been right. The masquerade had not been real. None of it had been real. She was Edmund's little sister, and she had nothing. And this was the world confirming it. She turned toward the door. She did not run. She walked with the same straight-backed, still-handed precision she had practiced for 4 years. Because that precision was the only thing she had ever owned. And she was not going to lose it in front of Lady Margrave. She was 3 steps from the corridor when his voice came across the room. "Stop." 1 word. Not shouted. Spoken in the same level, low register he used for everything. The voice that carried authority not through volume, but through the absolute refusal to raise itself. The room stopped. The applause stopped. Arabella's smile stopped. Lord Ashworth stood at the center of the hall. He was not beside Arabella. He was not beside his aunt. He had moved, at some point in the last 30 seconds, to the center of the floor, and he stood there in his dark coat, with his hands at his sides, and his face stripped of every mask it had ever worn. "My aunt speaks without my authority," he said. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. "I have made no proposal to Miss Lyndhurst. I have given no ring. I have signed no contract." He paused. The pause lasted the length of a held breath. "I wish to be very clear about what I have done." He turned. His gaze found Cecily at the edge of the doorway. Her hand was still on the cameo. Her face was still composed. Her eyes were not. He walked toward her. 3 strides. The floor between them vanished in a silence so complete that the crackle of the fire was audible from the far end of the hall. "I am asking Miss Cecily Fenwick to be my wife." 10 words. He said them once. He did not raise his voice. He did not ornament the sentence with feeling or apology or justification. He said it the way he said, "Come inside and sit down and you will finish inside," the same plain, undeniable authority applied to the largest thing he had ever asked for. The hall was silent. Lady Margrave's hand, still holding her glass, dropped slowly to her side. The glass tilted. A thin line of champagne ran down her glove and dripped onto the floor, and she did not notice, and no one told her. Arabella closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted in her face. Not anger, not defeat, but the quiet, private recognition of a woman who had understood in the space of 10 words that the script she had been given was not the script being performed. Edmund made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. He looked at his sister. He looked at his oldest friend. He pressed his lips together and nodded once. And the nod said everything he could not say with a glass of punch in his hand, and tears threatening the corners of his eyes. The squire's wife, the one who had whispered about Edmund's sister, and her nothing and her charity, pressed her hand to her mouth. The clergyman, seated in his chair near the fire, smiled the slow smile of a man who had heard a sonatina played from memory and understood what it meant. Lord Ashworth stood before Cecily. He did not touch her. He waited. His hand was at his side, and his face was open, and the mask was gone. And what lived behind it was not cold and not severe, and not any of the words the season had used to describe him. What lived behind it was a man who had arrived too late once and refused to arrive too late again. "My lord," Cecily said. Her voice was very quiet. "You do not know what you are asking for." "I know precisely what I am asking for," he said. "I have known since you played the Clementi from memory in a cold room at 7 in the morning, and did not think anyone was listening." Her hand dropped from the cameo. She looked at him. She looked at the hall full of faces turned toward her, the faces that had decided she was nothing, and she saw something she had not expected to see. She saw them revising. She saw the squire's wife blinking, and the clergyman nodding, and Edmund pressing his knuckles against his mouth, and Lady Margrave standing very still beside the Christmas tree, with champagne on her glove, and something moving behind her eyes that might, in a different woman, have been the first faint tremor of shame. "Yes," Cecily said. She said it once. She did not ornament it. The word was enough. It had always been enough. What had been missing was someone to hear it. Lord Ashworth offered his hand. She placed her fingers in his, and his hand closed. And the closing was the same as the first time, the door finding its frame, except that this time neither of them was wearing a mask. The fire had burned low by the time the last guest departed. Snow had begun to fall sometime after midnight, and by the time Cecily stood at the window of the small parlor, the east corridor was dark, and the courtyard below was white and quiet. The pianoforte stood against the far wall, its keys catching the light from a single candle on the stand. Lord Ashworth came into the parlor carrying 2 cups of tea he had made himself, because the kitchen staff had gone to bed, and he had not wanted to wake them. He set one on the ledge beside her. The cup was plain earthenware, not the fine porcelain Lady Margrave would have chosen, and the tea was slightly too strong, and it was the most valuable thing anyone had given Cecily in 4 years. "Drink," he said. She drank. He stood beside her at the window, not touching her, watching the snow cover the courtyard in the particular silence of Christmas morning. His hand went briefly to his breast pocket, where the miniature of Charlotte lived, and pressed once, and withdrew. "She would have liked you," he said. He did not say the name. He did not need to. Cecily had heard the story from Edmund on the second day, and she had understood then the nature of the walled room behind Lord Ashworth's eyes. "I would have liked her," Cecily said. The snow continued. The candle on the pianoforte stand burned steadily, and the cameo at Cecily's collar caught the light from it, the ivory gleaming softly, her mother's name hidden on the back in script so fine you had to hold it close. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He did not move toward her. He did not move away. He simply stood, solid and warm and present, in the room where she had played a sonatina from memory when she thought no one was listening. And the snow fell, and the tea cooled, and the house around them was quiet with the kind of quiet that comes after a long, difficult thing has finally been said. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's journey stirred something in you, leave a word for her below. She waited a long time to be seen. The cameo gleamed at her throat. The snow kept falling. And Cecily Fenwick, who had arrived at Hartfield House with nothing but her name and the memory of a borrowed veil, was home.